years where Hunter Biden owed so much money, just let the statute of limitations lapse for those years when it dealt with the Burisma income. So I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
The gentleman from Texas, yield the balance of your time. I thank you very much. So to the chairman's point, this 1023 is the mother of all corroborating evidence. It tells from the other side what the circumstantial evidence already indicates about the payment of money for Hunter Biden on this board for which he did nothing. The Devin Archer thing about calling Washington. The fact that Joe Biden made the audible on the airplane flying about holding the money to force the firing of Shokin, the prosecutor that Burisma, that Zlochevsky, and didn't want to get rid of, didn't want to see, you know, he wanted him gone because he was worried about being protected. And the phrase that you just read, Mr. Chairman, is saying, the CHS is saying, I wasn't involved in this stuff, so I don't know. But he seemed credible when he was telling me he bribed Joe and Hunter Biden. Yep. All right, expired the time.
Gentleman, Texas yields back. The chair now recognizes.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from California is recognized on the amendment.
Happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Sheila Jackson-Lee.
I thank the gentleman from California, and this is to emphasize to the multiple gentle persons across the aisle that my amendment, the Jackson Amendment, has much merit because it is based on the fact that you have no facts and you have no truth. Isn't it interesting that we would rely upon two nations, Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine previously under the dominance of Russia, despotic leadership until they broke free, seeking a level of democracy, pleading for them to be able to be a nation that welcomes the values of equality and justice and the management of laws so that there is fairness. But yet my friends are trying to dismiss my amendment, which is solely suggesting that you have no facts on what happens in countries like Russia. They constantly do confidential or covert recordings. They constantly do that. They have no basis in what the person is saying is true or not. No knowledge of the veracity of what is said, but they're going around recording everyone, called confidential human source. And so the confidential human source that is being relied upon by the Republicans met Zlochevsky in person on one occasion and has spoken to him only twice on the telephone. As such, the confidential human source is not able to provide any further opinion as to the veracity of Zlochevsky's aforementioned statements. Of course, my amendment should be voted on and accepted because President Biden has been proven over and over again he had nothing to do with Burisma, nothing. So to respond to all of those who are trying to cite a confidential human source, it is of no value. It is like pouring a water into a pot full of holes. When you get through, you have nothing. We don't have anything. And so I would ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment, which indicates that with all of the thousands of pages from the Treasury Department, from the FBI, IRS, all these agencies, the White House willingness to be open and to present themselves forward, there is no reason to proceed as we are proceeding. Ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment.
Gentleman yields.
I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is gentleman's time has expired from Arizona. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment, and then we'll have the vote on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let's talk about that just a little bit more. Evidence, this is not, actually everybody thinks this can sound lawyerly, but it's just very straightforward. Evidence is anything that comes within the rules of admissibility that tends to make any matter, any proposition, more probable or less probable, meaning that it has probative force, tends to prove one way or the other. And they have all these rules in evidence about when somebody who's not in court and says something that was said out of court wants to testify about that, when that can be allowed. And here we have what's called, it looks like preliminarily a double hearsay problem. The CHS is not here testifying. And Prigozhin and Zlochevsky, the guys who say they paid a bribe, certainly aren't here. But what this is a situation, let me give you a hypothetical, slightly different situation. Let's assume it's not the confidential human source, or the confidential human source isn't having a conversation with Prigozhin and Zlochevsky, but he's somewhere nearby, and he hears them talking. He eavesdrops on them, and they're talking about having paid bribes to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden of $5 million each. Now, in that situation also, the person in the position of the CHS, the eavesdropper, would not know whether Zlochevsky and Prigozhin are being truthful or not in saying they paid bribes, but that does not mean it is not evidence. It is evidence. And it comes in through the hearsay rules because those people are describing a criminal conspiracy. The statements of a co-conspirator are so-called admissions of a party opponent. They come in through that rule. This is straight up direct evidence of bribery. Now, you can say, if you want to, that you're not persuaded by the direct evidence, the person admitting that they committed a bribe or undertook a bribery scheme, but it's not that it's not evidence. So you could say, well, I think there's evidence, and it's admissible evidence, and a jury would be well-founded deciding on the basis of that evidence to convict for bribery, but I'm not going to do an investigation anyway. I'm not going to support bringing in the witness who is defying the subpoena of the Congress because I'm just not persuaded by that direct evidence of bribery. I understand that would be a contention you can make. But again, even in this age when you talk about, I want you to tell your truth and I'm going to tell my truth, which is abysmal and absurd on its face, I didn't know that we had started changing the definition of evidence. But there is evidence. And even to those people who say, well, it sounds like it's circumstantial evidence and indirect evidence. Well, by the way, lots of people were convicted on circumstantial and indirect evidence. But that's not the case either here. When the bribery conspirator is overheard or is heard saying, I engaged in a bribe with that person, that's direct evidence of bribery. And so, and I'm, in terms of credibility, again, I'd love to evaluate the confidential human source. I think the country ought to get the chance to evaluate the confidential human source in this case. It's that important. But if you want to say, and again, what's in the FBI and the United States Attorney have both evaluated him, they tell us, and they say this confidential human source is credible. So if he were in the situation of being an eavesdropper, that means he really did what he says he really heard what he says he heard. So some people won't be satisfied no matter what evidence is offered, and that's clear. But there's lots of evidence. And with that, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
I thank the gentleman from...
Is recognized.
I hadn't even asked yet. I appreciate that, Mr.
I
Chairman.
knew you wanted to talk, brother. I knew. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank my colleague from North Carolina for his legislation. I do disagree with the scope and direction of this. In fact, I'm uncertain about some of the aspects of it. My recollection of Section 1983 litigation is that it's enormously complicated. And as the chairman suggested, having a hearing in advance to sort of figure out what the exact scope of this would be would have been advisable given the nature of this. And I definitely had concerns about the legislation stripping all federal employees of any immunity for conduct within the scope of their employment, as long as it's connected to the First Amendment rights. And I got to say that the examples that my colleagues from North Carolina and Wyoming have offered don't offer me assurance or clear guidance on what the scope of this would be or what it would do. And I do want to raise a question too, and we'll have an amendment about this down the road, but with respect to the explicit exemption of the president and the vice president, I had concerns about that. So just to sort of walk through this a little bit, and I think the ranking member touched on this, it sounds like under this legislation, if an employee mid to low level potentially makes some kind of statement or takes some kind of act that under this provision could be viewed or interpreted as depriving anyone of their rights, privileges, or immunities as secured by the First Amendment, he or she would be personally liable. This doesn't speak to, for example, whether this person is acting in response to a superior, say like someone in an agency or department, have immediate superiors, have a secretary over them too, who might guide guide the statements that they would be making. And certainly the president ultimately would be responsible for those statements that are made as well. So for, in the current scenario, federal employees have limited ability to make statements already. For that reason, the government wants to make sure that there's consistency in the statements that are made. And so for testimony, for example, before a congressional hearing has to go through OMB for approval, just to make sure there's coordination. But I would ask my colleague from North Carolina, so in the instance where an individual who is not the secretary of a department or even secretary or even director or administrator of a particular department or agency makes a statement that is viewed as being in conflict with this, would that implicate the secretary of that department and or the president when that statement is made?
Ask a clarification. If they make a statement that does, say that again if you just repeat the question.
Makes a statement that, we're hypothetically here, is in violation or triggers this provision that creates personal liability.
So you're saying if a lower level employee does something that would deprive an American of their First Amendment rights?
Let's take one of your examples. So I think you had something about Catholic parents, I think it was for school boards.
Yeah.
Okay.
If someone's victimized by that.
Well, walk me through that one. So who would you say is?
It's really, I think, pretty simple, Mr. Ivey, and what it does, this legislation replicates exactly the state of affairs that exists for state officials, state and local officials, under Title 42, Section 1983. Does it exactly. Only thing it changes is if someone acts under color of federal law, as opposed to under color of state law, they would be liable. So yes, police officers who beat someone savagely, even though they're not high-ranking, are subject to liability under Section 1983.
Let's stop there, because that's the example I had in mind. So for example, 1983 is used actually to go after police officers, typically when they've acted outside the scope of their employment and committed acts that are beyond what is viewed as normal policing under the circumstances.
Right.
In fact, it violates the standard in their training.
That's right.
And so therefore they're personally liable. By the way, I haven't seen any of these incidents where their commander said, yeah, continue to beat him to death. So the incidents that we're talking about.
Right. I don't believe, I'm not.
So let's stay with this though. So if mid-level employee makes a statement, and the ones that you all have cited apparently have been, I think you said in some of these hearings, you think were driven by the Attorney General or other, heads of departments. Would the heads of those departments be liable too?
Absolutely.
All right, and how would you prove causation under that scenario?
Give me a set of circumstances and I'll link it up for you.
This is your hypothetical.
Well, I know, I mean,
Or
you're saying how would I prove causation without giving me a set of facts to I can say this, if the director of the FBI approved a policy under which the FBI embedded itself in a way that the clearly established law, that's what the protection of the qualified immunity doctrine provides that was just criticized a moment ago, instructs FBI agents to embed themselves with social media companies and to coerce them or interact with them so extensively in decisions what to do with discourse of the American people that they're taking down millions of tweets, the director of the FBI would be civilly liable under this language.
I apologize.
That's fine. The time of the gentleman has expired. I'll recognize the gentleman from North Carolina if he wants to go now for continued dialogue. But
I'll wait and see what else develops. Unless if no one else wants to go, I'll certainly ready to.
Yep. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my support for the bill.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Herr, I'm way down here at the end of the dais. I think today the Justice Department released the transcripts of the interviews with President Biden. Are you aware of that?
I understand that to be true, yes.
Did you have any involvement in the decision or the timing of the release of the transcripts?
No, Congressman.
Did you make any recommendation about the release of the transcripts or being done or not?
I did not. That was above my pay grade.
Yeah, I don't know why they've been released so close to this hearing, but it sort of, it impacts our ability to evaluate your report and ask you questions about it. So, but there's one point, just as an illustration, on 221 of your report, you're describing, I think, as the Afghan pack or something like that, about in 2009, I think, as the information came from. And you say, as one reason not to prosecute, Mr. Biden says, in addition, Mr. Biden told us in his interview that he does not recognize the marking confidential as a classification marking. To him, the marking means the document should be held in confidence, but not necessarily that it is classified. And footnote 866 is a reference, and it refers to the Biden 10-9-23 transcript at 24 and 25. Now, we have that now, but we haven't until this morning. But I just want to read from that exchange. This is on page 24 at line 15. Mr. Crickbaum. So this is a typewritten document. It's got a confidential, what appears to be a stamp at the top. And the top of the document indicates it's from the American AM Embassy, Kabul. It's dated what appears to me to be November 09. The only question I have for you about this, Mr. President, is the confidential marking. Do you recognize that to be a classification marking? President Biden, no. I mean, confidential doesn't want to get around. It's not in a category, I don't think, of code word, top secret, that kind of thing, but I don't even know where it came from. Mr. Crickbaum, are you familiar with confidential as a level of classified information? President Biden, well, if I got a document that said confidential, it would mean that no one else could see it but me, and you give it or the people working on this issue. Mr. Crickbaum, and are you aware that among certain categories of classified information, there is top secret, secret, and there's also a category of classified information called confidential? Is that something that you are aware of or not? President Biden, yes, I was aware of it. I don't ever remember when I got any document that was confidential that was meant for me to read and or discuss with the people who sent me the memo, so. And then it trails off. So as I read those answers, they're equivocal. He at first says he doesn't know. Do you recognize that to be a classification marking? He said no, and then goes on to explain. But then Mr. Crickbaum came back and he said, are you aware that among certain categories of classified information, there's also a category of classified information called confidential? And he says, yes, I was aware of it. So Mr. Hurd, just in that one instance, there seems to be a discrepancy between the conclusion in the report or the summary of the evidence in the report and what the transcript says. Can you offer any guidance to this committee why you would put that summary in your report as opposed to saying that he gave inconsistent answers, or in fact, why didn't you nail down in the transcript which was the right answer? He's given answers that says no, and then he says yes. Why didn't you pursue it until you knew?
Congressman, the report reflects our best efforts to summarize and characterize the evidence in the investigation, including the investigation we received from the president himself during our interview of him. But as you point out, the transcripts of the president's interview over 2 days are now available to the committee for their inspection, and the members are able to draw their own conclusions based on the transcripts that are now available to them.
Well, and I appreciate your answer. And I certainly think things, you can come up with some details that someone can disagree on, and it has the quality, I know, of some cherry picking because I've just found something, but we've only had a little bit of time to look. I don't think it serves this process well for the Justice Department to dump these transcripts into the public right now. If they were going to be released, they should have been released at a proper time. And I think I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yield. The gentleman yield.
I will yield to the chairman.
Just real quick, Mr. Hurd, someone earlier said, said something about changing the facts. You said, I'm not going to change the facts, but let's keep the facts the same, but change the subject. If you had the same facts and the individual that you were investigating was 65 and had a good memory, do you reach the same conclusion?
Congressman, as I responded earlier to a question along these lines, I am not here to entertain hypotheticals about facts or circumstances that may be different. What I did was assess the evidence and the facts that I obtained in this investigation and make a judgment based on this set of evidence.
Fair enough. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington.
Cummins, with some economy of time, do you wish to respond to the last barrage?
Well, only to say that nobody disputes that when a law enforcement is fired upon, that they have a right to fire back. The point is that everything that created that situation was incompetent, unnecessary, and reckless. And it defied the law because, as a former assistant, you know the Fourth Amendment cases that allow either a no-knock or what I would call a tap-and-go type entry with no real waiting for someone to come to the door are only justified by exigent circumstances that do not exist in this case. So in my opinion, as a former U.S. attorney, this was a completely illegal search because of the forced entry and the lack of time they gave the occupants of a fairly large home to get up at 6 in the morning. The law requires them to wait for enough time, for a reasonable amount of time for someone to come to the door and admit them in.
50 seconds.
And I assume the local prosecutor
My time. Yes. You've had plenty. And Mr. Cummins, I appreciate that very effective rebuttal. Here's what's interesting to me as this hearing evolves. I hear Mr. Goldman defending the practice that he says is engaged in every day. And earlier on, the ranking member invoked the Breonna Taylor episode, and I've just been sitting here reviewing it. Mr. Goldman said earlier on, well, this wasn't a no-knock warrant. Okay, what's the difference in the situation if they knock and they blow in, in 20 seconds, or it's a no-knock? In fact, in the Breonna Taylor case, that wasn't a no-knock warrant. They said they knocked and waited 45 seconds, and they went in. Mm-hmm. Here's something that's interesting. In the Breonna Taylor thing, she was killed on March 13, 2020. In that, it was execution of a search warrant, just like this one.
Murder.
Time belongs to the gentleman.
First police officer was fired June 20. In September 2020, Louisville entered into a $12 million settlement with the family. Have you been made any overtures by the Department of Justice to settle liability against the government on behalf of Mr. Malinowski's family?
No, sir.
In September, also, one of the police officers was indicted for willful endangerment or wanton endangerment. A second officer was fired in January 2021. A third officer was retired in April 2021. Oh, I left out. In October 2020, grand jury testimony was leaked. Later in 2021, the DOJ indicted 4 officers, and even now it's retrying one who were for the hung jury. I don't understand the difference. I don't understand my colleagues' reaction that
if you would yield, I could share the difference with you.
You've talked for a long time. I'm going to talk during my time.
Okay, then I would tell you the difference.
Maybe you can provide context for your egregious double standard. No one that I recall on the Republican side, when the Breonna, by the way, you said this was interfering in the process to have this hearing. The first time Congress had a hearing was in June 2020 over the Breonna Taylor episode. There was no concern about interfering. The concern was about the use of this kind of tactic to enter unnecessarily and jeopardize people's lives. Yep. Now suddenly that seems to be of no concern whatsoever. Can you account for that difference, Mr. Cummins?
The facts are very similar, although that was a drug investigation, and under the case law, they are allowed to go in faster because of the potential for destruction of evidence.
Yes, so in this case, we're talking about conduct that the law would say is malum prohibitum, not malum in se. In other words, what the reason they entered this residence and jeopardized this entire family, including Ms. Malinowski, who has no allegations against her, and shot this man dead, is because he didn't have the proper license for the business they say he was engaged in. And it's even disputed about whether he was engaged in that business.
Correct.
And in that case, Ms. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was without any contradiction engaging in illicit drug activity and receiving and he was a drug dealer, and he was carrying it on in her place of residence. I can't account for the gross disparity, except that Americans hear a lot, and I hear a lot back about concern about a double standard of justice. Is there a double standard of justice here, Mr. Cummins, in those two episodes?
There appears to be, and that causes a loss of trust in government and in these agencies.
Mr. Klickner, the only place I see reaction, besides a hearing like this exposing stuff, is that attorneys general across the nation have sued over the two rules, the business engaging in the business rule that's at issue here, I guess, really, and the pistol brace rule. Why is that the only recourse that people have state attorneys general file litigation?
I don't understand your question, Congressman. Are you saying that they should be?
My time's expired anyway. We wanted to get a new one. I'm ran out.
Well, we can give you a chance to, you want to rephrase the question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I can rephrase the question. Here's what I'm saying. Congress doesn't seem to be able to do anything to press back against this overreach. At least it hasn't, including under Republican leadership. The only thing that seems to be available to people for the government to do to provide recourse is I see a state attorneys general out filing lawsuits in great numbers, 21 states in one case, 24. Is that the only recourse that people can expect from their government in the response to these kinds of abuses?
It apparently is the only one they have, but it's not what they should expect. We should expect that the administrative agency is reined in a little bit here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're trying. The chair recognizes gentlelady from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the Malinowski killing, did you say you're deferring to and waiting for this investigation from the Arkansas State Police?
The Arkansas State Police has referred the matter to the district attorney's office. It's my understanding from public
and you've
statement.
been deferring until that to take any action yourself. Is that right?
That would be our normal course of action if there's a pending criminal investigation. In order to make sure that we preserve the integrity of that investigation, we let it proceed. Yes.
So that's a criminal investigation only.
They'll decide the scope. My understanding is they're investigating to see.
That's a criminal investigation. Let's stay on my question. That's a criminal investigation.
It's an investigation to see whether Arkansas law was violated, is my understanding.
That's called a criminal investigation, right? They're a criminal law enforcement agency. Don't filibuster me. Straightforward.
I'm not filibustering. You know that state prosecutors have a variety of different.
That's my time. The Arkansas State Police, in their press release on April 24, 22, said, "We do not have the authority to address methods and tactics used or whether agency protocols and policies were followed." Have you seen that?
I've seen the press release that they have.
You've seen that?
Correct.
So you're deferring action on questions of methods and tactics until you see what Arkansas does with the criminal investigation?
That is the normal standard thing that we do, because if you start interviewing witnesses, if you start talking to people in the middle of a criminal investigation, very quickly people start talking about the fact that the integrity of that investigation.
Mr. Dettelbach,
it's very important to respect the ongoing investigation.
Mr. Dettelbach, in the Brianna, did you watch yesterday's hearing by any chance?
I did not have a chance to watch all of yesterday's hearing. I watched
Did you watch some of it?
I watched some of it.
Well, in the Louisville situation with Breonna Taylor, the Metropolitan Police Department there fired its first officer within 90 days of the incident. They were doing that as a matter of their management responsibility. By the way, the Justice Department, of which your agency is a component, has conducted a pattern and practice investigation and is pursuing enforcement action against the Louisville Police Department. What is your excuse for not taking managerial action about the appropriateness of the tactics used in the Malinowski killing?
I think you would agree with me that police officers and agents are entitled to due process just like everybody else.
There's no doubt about that. That doesn't answer my question. Don't you have management responsibility with respect to the way the agency is conducting such matters?
When we can, based upon the review, and I don't expect it to be a lengthy period of time, we would conduct use of force review as we do in every matter like this that occurs, and we will do that in this case as we do in every matter.
Well, what's soon enough? They acted in Louisville within 3 months. What's soon enough?
Respectfully, we'll see that the investigation will end, and then we will commence our internal review, as we always do.
Concerning body cams, you testified that the rollout within ATF was incomplete. Is it your testimony that the rollout has not extended to ATF personnel in Arkansas, and that's the reason they didn't have body cams?
The field division that covers Arkansas has not yet been implemented. That's correct.
Okay. And you said, what did you say the cost was of your item there? Something in the tens of millions. Was it 40 million, 45 million?
This isn't the downstream costs because there's huge data costs, as you know, with this. But the initial implementation cost, the request in the budget is $37.5 million.
37 million. So I understand your budget is about 1.7. Well, your budget's about 1.7 billion. So if my calculator is right, that's about 2.6% of your budget. You couldn't find 2.6% of your budget to catch up with common practice among also resource-constrained city police departments all over the country?
Respectfully, our budget is not 1.7, it's 1.625.
Whatever.
And the reason I know that is because that $45 million cut has resulted in not being able to hire agents.
Yeah, but you're talking about something else. I'm talking about body cams that are in common use among metropolitan police departments across this country. And you're saying something that involves 2 or 3% of your budget prevented you from getting it done?
I'm saying that we're in the process, as we said from the beginning, of implementing the policy in phases.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Director.
We continue.
Mr. Director, let me ask you this question. I understand there could be justifications for lots of things about putting tape on, jamming signals, things like that in a certain set of circumstances. What can possibly justify deferring, as that video showed, deferring the execution of that search warrant until the person who justifies the use of such tactics, if there's a question of a risk of violence, was present in the home?
These are career law enforcement agents and police.
I didn't ask that.
And they make determinations.
I asked you what could possibly justify that.
In my experience, when an agent decides, when a cop decides to go through a door, when a cop decides to execute an operation, they are entitled, if they're correct, the warrant allowed that warrant to be executed on the day it was executed. We'll see what the investigation says, but Congressman, armchair quarterbacking police officers who are risking their lives without evidence yet is not the way to go here.
That's about 5,000 words and not one justification uttered, not one possible justification. My time has expired. Mr. Attorney General, you said earlier today you spoke to the committee's recommendation to the House to hold you in contempt. You said, but we have made clear that we will not provide audio recordings from which the transcripts that you already have were created. You went on to say that certain members of this committee and the Oversight Committee are seeking contempt. You're aware that a majority of this committee has marked up a contempt resolution, aren't you, sir?
Certain members includes the majority, yes.
It's a big difference, isn't it, sir? Isn't that significant? The fact that a majority of the committee charged by the Congress to inquire into the grounds for impeaching the President of the United States has marked up a contempt resolution. That's more important than certain members, isn't it, sir?
Majority.
Institutionally, more important.
A majority has sought contempt, yes.
You said that you will not be intimidated. Are you the arbiter?
I'm sorry?
Are you the arbiter, the decider of whether or not those tapes will be provided to this Congress at the subpoena of its committee to investigate the president?
Constitution requires me to protect the separation of powers and our ability to do investigations in the future. It requires me, and the court proceedings make that clear, to weigh whatever interests you have against the interests of law enforcement. The president has asserted executive privilege, and I have not heard a legitimate legislative reason why the audio is insufficient for any purpose, the legitimate purpose.
You know what demeanor evidence is, don't you, sir?
I'm sorry?
Demeanor evidence. You know what that is. You sat on the bench for decades. You know
I know what demeanor evidence is.
Okay.
I know what demeanor evidence is, and I've not been shown any reason why audio evidence of demeanor would make a difference in any legislative purpose.
Well, that's exactly what demeanor evidence is, sir. Witnessing and observing a witness as they testify. And what can be done by this committee is to observe the audio recording of the president testifying to see whether it comports with the transcript or whether it reveals things about his capacity or his veracity or anything else that comes from his demeanor as he is interviewed.
Well, none of the things that you just mentioned are a legislative purpose. I'm yet to suggest any law that you intend to pass or thinking about in which the audio would make a difference over the transcript.
If a future DOJ concludes, well, let me ask you this question. What happened to Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon when they decided to defy a subpoena of the Congress?
We received 4 referrals, criminal referrals. 2 were prosecuted, 2 were not. The 2 that were prosecuted, as the published court opinions make clear,
what will happen to you if your decision is baseless?
May I continue to answer?
No, I know what happened. You know what happened too. Mr. Navarro's in prison. What will happen to you if your sole determination that you're not going to cooperate with this committee's subpoena is
with respect to the 2 people you asked, the court made clear they did not comply in any way, did not even appear, and second, there was no executive privilege. Neither of those is true in my case.
If a future Department of Justice follows the facts and the law, as you're fond of reciting, even to the point of prosecuting a former president, then if your decision is baseless, you should be prosecuted, right?
If a future, and I hope it will be the case, a future Justice Department follows the law and the decisions of the Office of Legal Counsel since the Reagan administration, when there is an assertion of executive privilege, the contempt statute is inapplicable. That's been the rule through every administration, including the Reagan administration. It even reached back to the Eisenhower administration.
Mr. Attorney
I hope
General,
they will follow the law.
Mr. Attorney General, you have resurrected the Foreign Influence Task Force, and there's an FBI spokesman recently told media, according to reports, that FBI has returned to facilitating the sharing of information about foreign malign influence with social media companies in a way that reinforces that private companies are free to decide on their own whether and how to take action on that information. A district court has decided that you didn't do that before. How are you doing that? How are you reinforcing that private companies have their own capacity to decide?
The case that you're talking about is now under advisement in the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm not going to comment on any court matter which the court may...
I didn't ask you to do that. I asked you to ask you how you're reinforcing it. That's what your spokesman said. You're reinforcing the private company's latitude. How are you doing that?
I'm not going to comment on what the district court said. We have the authority, as the Supreme Court just held last week, to persuade. We can't coerce. So we can provide information that Russia or China or Iran or North Korea is operating on a social media platform.
Why don't you do it in public?
And then we leave it to the social media to take it down.
Why don't you do it in public?
I'm sorry?
Why don't you do that in public so the public can see what you're doing?
Well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't also do it in public.
Well, I think
would hope
you should.
Everybody in this room would want to know if one of our adversaries is acting as if they were American citizens on a social
You're
media.
Back. Time the gentleman's expired.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ellison, you've opined that you see no antitrust violation here. Have your fellow state attorneys general, some of them expressed the opposite opinion?
Some of them have.
Thanks, sir. You said that you drew this distinction between there being an agreement in restraint of trade or concert of action without an agreement. Let me ask this of another witness, one of the participants in the Climate Action 100 Plus. There's something I understand called a signatory handbook. Is that right, Mr. Bienvenu?
I'm not sure about a signatory handbook, but there are signatories.
There are signatories. You're aware there's signatories. Ms. Luber, right? There's signatories as a signatory handbook, isn't there?
There is a microphone, please.
Turn your microphone on, please, ma'am.
Sorry.
And so, look, in my long experience practicing law before I entered the public sector, signing something generally signified something. What do you understand signing to mean, Mr. Bienvenu?
As I understand it, one of the critical things at signing, it says that every decision that has been made and will be made is independently made. It is made in the best interests of those investors, whether that's investment decisions, proxy voting decisions, engagement decisions.
Signing, let me put it more simply, does signing indicate agreement?
No, it indicates that every investor will look at the financial implications of climate risk.
So they're signing to say they're not agreeing to anything, they're just, they're agreeing not to agree?
No,
is that what the signature's about?
They are agreeing to address and look at the financial risks and implication of climate change, whether it's the $93 billion cost to our global economy, to our U.S. economy last year, to look at it.
Ms. Luber, do you understand that agreements to restrain trade are unlawful?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Including an agreement to exert combined economic power to suppress output or increase prices. That's a cartel, right?
And that is absolutely not what Climate Action 100.
So your signers, your signatories are not agreeing to do that, right?
They are not agreeing. They are agreeing to look at climate risk. And each of them says, and the disclaimers in every piece of the material.
Do you seek output reductions of fossil fuels? You do not.
No, the first discussions that have taken place, number one, are disclosure of information. Our market does better when they understand that the insurance industry is pulling out many of our most important states.
Yes, ma'am. No, if we could just answer my questions for a minute. I understand the Climate Action 100 Plus was designed to harness the collective influence of those signers. Is that right?
To consider climate risk. Not to, each investor has said.
Just to consider it, not to pressure anybody?
That's right. Each investor votes their own shares, has their own conversations, and needs to. I'm sure CalPERS has 100 staff that are advising their investment office. They are looking at independently, and they are not looking at what somebody else does.
According to the Climate Action 100 Plus work plan, what I read is that Climate Action 100 Plus was, quote, designed to harness the collective influence of its investor members in order to spur companies on the Climate Action 100 focus list of 170 disfavored companies to accelerate their emissions reductions. Is that right?
If there's a financial risk to those emissions reductions, that's right. Everything about the analysis of companies and investors is about, is there a financial risk?
So, okay, but it further says that the initiative's goal is for, quote, all companies on the focus list to have committed to net zero or gone out of business as investors are no longer providing them with capital.
Yeah,
that sounds coercive to me. Does it sound coercive to you?
It does not sound coercive.
You ever heard the phrase in the movies, it's a nice little business to be ashamed if something were to happen to it? Isn't that kind of the same thing?
In fact, it is the opposite. The requests of the investors of companies is more disclosure, is adequate, appropriate information for consumers, for people investing.
How many companies have left the Climate Action 100 Plus in the past 6 months?
I'm sorry, how many companies?
How many companies have left?
I believe about a dozen. I don't have the exact number.
Ms. Lamb, you wrote an update to your investors on January 2021, didn't you? It says, the 117th Congress is the most diverse yet. Equality is on the investor and corporate agenda, and the Black Lives Matter movement defined 2020 alongside a global pandemic. And here we are facing a second civil war, this one cultural, led by a pro-white, pro-Christian agenda. In other words, make America great again. Did you write those words?
That was a newsletter I wrote following the violent insurrection on the Capitol.
Do you think we're facing a civil war?
The context of that writing was around culture.
Do you think we're facing a civil war, ma'am? Will you answer that question?
From my perspective, we are pro-equality, pro-diversity, pro-religious freedom.
So you won't answer my question whether you think we're facing.
Sorry, what I was describing in that piece,
I'll ask you one more time, ma'am.
Reacting to the current events was around culture.
Do you think we're facing a civil war?
I don't think we're facing a civil war.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On June 25, 2024, just 2 days before this markup, the committee received a letter from the White House stating that the committee's subpoena raises significant separation of powers issues because there are executive branch interests at stake. And I'd like you to bear that in mind. I'll come back to the dating and the timing of all this. June 25, just 2 days ago is when the letter appeared. Almost simultaneously, the White House sent a similar letter to Mr. Zwanitzer's attorney stating that he, for those same reasons, quote, is not authorized to provide any of the president's information, close quote, until the White House has reviewed any production. Mr. Zwanitzer's attorney then transmitted a letter to the committee stipulating in effect, that he would follow the White House's instruction and not release any responsive information. This amendment addresses the White House's and Mr. Swanitzer's meritless last-minute delay tactics, and it's here that I want to return to the timing. All this began with a letter from the committee to Mr. Swanizer on February 14, 4.5 months ago. The committee's subpoena was issued March 22, 2024. The White House, by the content of the letter they sent, makes clear that it has been in touch with Mr. Swanizer throughout. Let me tell you something. It didn't take the White House 3 months to figure out that it was going, that it, if it, whatever, it doesn't have any merit here, but whatever argument it was going to make, that it was going to make that argument. We heard a lot from the minority as this hearing opened on this markup about politics. Well, what you see in the White House tendering a letter to obstruct the committee 2 days before the markup and 3 months after the issuance of the subpoena is a bad faith, dilatory tactic to interfere with the exercise of constitutional authority under the impeachment inquiry resolution, vesting power in this committee. That's exactly what it is. As an initial matter, the White House letter states that the committee's demand is for the, quote, president's information. But the subpoenaed information in Mr. Swanitzer's possession are not the president's personal papers, but rather Mr. Swanitzer's materials that he used to write the president's book. Simply put, the responsive materials and information covered by the committee's subpoena belong to Mr. Swanizer, and the committee has appropriately chosen to pursue them from Mr. Swanizer. No executive privilege protects the subpoenaed materials and information from disclosure. In its letters, the White House failed to put forth any legal authority or support for its proposition that the executive privilege applies to conversations between a former vice president and a private citizen. It's odd for the White House to raise the prospect that the material President Biden discussed with Mr. Swanizer could possibly be covered by executive privilege when the president discussed the material with him for the purpose of writing a book, allowed him to keep the material after the book project was over, and apparently did not have any contract with Mr. Swanizer requiring him to keep the material confidential. No protection for it at all. Additionally, the White House did not exert executive privilege over the material before it was disclosed to Special Counsel Hur's office. Therefore, any conceivable executive privilege over the material has been waived. And moreover, the White House relies on the Supreme Court's ruling in Trump versus Mazars, except the Mazars framework only applies to personal information about the president held by third parties that is covered by some sort of contractual or statutory obligation of confidentiality. As the committee has explained repeatedly to Mr. Swanizer, the Mazars ruling does not apply to the subpoena issued to him because he has not established that he is under any such obligation, especially since such information was used to write a publicly released memoir. The committee cannot allow the White House to interfere in our actions to carry out our constitutional oversight duties. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if my friend from North Carolina would engage in a colloquy. So if I'd like to pose a question to Ms. Ross, given what was just said. Mr. Swanizer was the ghostwriter of what you just described, and the ranking member before you described as a book about the death of President Biden's son. Why was President Biden, according to Special Counsel Hur, reading from classified materials about Afghanistan to his ghostwriter in a book that was solely about the death of President Biden's son? You don't care to answer? I can understand.
No, I didn't yield, and I don't have any information about that.
I see.
So I suggest that you use your 4
I'm not looking
minutes
for I'll reclaim
to
my
address
time then.
the contempt resolution.
Time belongs to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Yeah, that's my time. I offered to engage in a colloquy which would have the effect of refuting the absurd allegation that you made. But I can understand why you don't want to answer, because it's an irrefutable point. No one that I know about who's interested in securing Mr. Zwanitzer's compliance with the lawful process served upon him has had anything to say about the death of Beau Biden. No one's read from the parts of the book about Beau Biden to frame this matter. The question is, why was Joe Biden reading from classified materials to somebody without a security clearance in a matter for which he was going to be paid $8 million? And this Congress needs to investigate and consider what is necessary, and it is the committee vested by this House of Representatives with inquiring into the grounds for impeachment of the selfsame president. And the hypocrisy is mind-blowing. I wonder if Steve Bannon could imagine that someone might, for a political purpose, pursue a contempt resolution. But there's no political purpose here. It is the responsibility of this person who received classified information to provide what he has to this committee to evaluate. It's just almost, it's unspeakable. I was thinking about the legislative purpose that was cited in order to secure the personal private income tax returns of President Trump. We can all say with certainty that there was no motivation of a political sort involved in that. Wow. Calling the tune requires playing by the tune. But Mr. Zwanitzer is an ordinary citizen. The process served upon him to compel him to provide information to this committee is straightforward. He has, with the most frivolous of arguments, flouted his responsibility under law. It is this committee's responsibility to proceed. That's how it works. It's very simple, nothing more to it than that. It's time we get on with it. I'm fully in support of the ANS. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield to anyone.
From North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shapiro, I was struck by another example of what you described earlier accurately as projection in Mr. Swalwell's comments. The Democrats today are expressing solicitude for and chastise the majority for chilling the sacred expressive rights of multinational conglomerates based in foreign capitals, but interrogate you about the intricacies of your religious beliefs on sexual morality. I apologize on his behalf. If it were genuine, I would sympathize with the objective of keeping famous brands out of controversy, that they stick to sports and entertainment. But the World Federation of Advertisers and their GARM that they've created, their members, they and their members continue to seek to involve themselves in highly controversial issues. Your colleague Michael Knowles in an article last year pointed out that InBev is a member of WFA. And the pretext for what we're talking about today is they want to keep their brands out of trouble, but they rolled out the Dylan Mulvaney campaign and destroyed the famous Bud Light brand. But they would tell us that the purpose of this organization, all these global conglomerates are members of, is to keep their brands out of trouble. Disney's a member of the WFA, according to Mr. Knowles' article. The report that the committee has issued discloses intense activity by GARM around Musk's purchase of Twitter. They didn't like that. Mr. Rakowitz, in a February 2023 email, joked to his colleagues about, quote, being the idiot who challenged Musk on brand safety issues. Since then, Twitter is 80% below revenue forecasts. and I think that email can be taken a couple of ways, but it sort of appears that he's actually patting himself on the back. He was called an idiot, but he's saying, I'm the genius that took Twitter down 80% of its revenues. But there's also, one of the things that they didn't like about Twitter was that they say Mr. Rakowicz also wrote that he had connected with members of GARM's steer team, these guys, about Mr. Musk's leadership of Twitter, and Unilever has, quote, issues with overly partisan takes, e.g. Hunter Biden laptop exposure. I think Mr. Tiffany was onto something earlier when he begged the question about interference in American elections. And the question I think I'd like to pose, I've heard a lot from my colleagues in the time I've been here about foreign malign influence. The Hunter Biden laptop suppression very arguably had a significant impact on the outcome of the 2020 election. So is this foreign malign influence? And what determines whether foreign influence from London, for example, is malign?
Again, I think that one of the big problems here that we have is vague, unspecified, subjective standards that are posing as pseudo-objective standards. And under that guise, all bias falls in one direction. When all the bias keeps falling in one direction, you start to suspect that actually the standard is not objective. And once again, the standards that are being used by GARM are, as stated by the titular head of GARM, not aligned with the First Amendment. This is a person who is overtly criticized, according to the report, the First Amendment itself, talked about how those standards should not apply. So why wouldn't he apply his own standards or the standards of a political side of the aisle to advertising dollars if they could? I mean, the use, again, of advertising dollars as a cudgel in order to shut down one political side of the aisle, the effects of that are quite clear, certainly on a wide variety of businesses on the right.
So is it then, whether or not antitrust law as it currently exists extends to that, if foreign government or foreign-based political actors with global reach are using their economic power to limit the expressive rights of Americans, or certainly to intrude on and affect our electoral processes by favoring one political side or the other, to the point of, jumping and saying we don't like the Hunter Biden laptop being exposed, is that not a legitimate object for Congress certainly to look at? And then should Congress consider the extent of its regulatory power to protect Americans' expressive rights?
I mean, certainly quite dangerous when you have the EU working with GARM to set standards for what companies can and cannot advertise or should not advertise, while simultaneously attempting to regulate the social media companies that are largely the recipients of those ad dollars.
What accounts for the solicitude of my colleagues, the Democrats, for the international conglomerates' expressive rights and their disregard for the expressive rights of ordinary Americans?
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy is rather glaring. As I said earlier, the shocking adherence to free market capitalism and freedom of consumer choice on the left side of the aisle today is something to behold. They've invoked it almost as commonly as they've invoked Project 2025 today, which, frankly, I'm getting a little creeped out by. I think if they say it 3 times, then President Trump appears and challenges them to a golf match or something. It's like Beetlejuice.
It would be funny if it weren't so strange. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania. North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My objective in my 5 minutes, which is not much, is to hear from the moms. But before I do, I just want to take a trip down memory lane. Kate Steinle. Does anybody know her name? Kate Steinle. She was used to be a stark outlier. She was shot on a pier in San Francisco in 2015. It was accidental, I think they said. It was sort of an occasion, sort of a freak encounter with an illegal alien. Now we have a hearing in front of us today in which I think I counted 5 dead. I think I got 4 brutal sexual assaults, a couple of those children. And Laken Riley's murder seems to sort of have announced this new phase. In my own community, a Guatemalan was arrested in rural Gaston County on an Interpol warrant for a child rape. A Honduran was charged with murder 1 in Mecklenburg County, Charlotte, where I'm from, arrested in Houston. In July, a Honduran illegal 18-year-old with a 16-year-old undisclosed identity went on a random shooting spree in Charlotte, North Carolina, killing 1 person, injuring a number of people. It was an MS-13 gang initiation, we heard. We're hearing about Aurora, Colorado apartment buildings being taken over by local Venezuelan gangs. Eric Swalwell can laugh about it if he wants to. He thinks it's funny, but you're hearing reports, a guy standing in front of a city council talking about migrants, Haitian migrants, dumped like 20,000 of them, dumped on one small community in Ohio, picking up ducks to eat and killing cats to eat them. I don't know if it's happening or not. We'll find out. They denied the Aurora thing at first, right, too. Witnesses have come before committees I've been on, and they've talked about hyper-violence. To the ladies, to Ms. Lopez and Dr. Mendez, with all due respect, conditions are not the same in the United States as in the countries from which people are fleeing. That's why they're fleeing. If you replicate the conditions in those communities, what will you have solved? Where will people flee? So here's the thing. When I was elected in a special election in September 2019, in October I went to the border, and it was calm and quiet. There was one asylum seeker at the port of entry I went to, because in May all hell had broken loose, and the Trump administration had responded with the migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico, and it crushed the number of people coming in. It stopped the overwhelming flow. So the question I have for the moms, and I'm going to ask you one by one, do you think it's getting worse? And do you think it can get even worse than it is now? Ms. Nobles.
Yes, most definitely. We're seeing more and more cases every day, a lot, way too many.
Ms. Fundner.
Yes, absolutely. Fentanyl is just, every year it gets larger and larger, the deaths. I mean, this is on American soil. We have 300,000 people dead since 2021 under the Biden-Harris administration, and it's just growing, and we expect it to be much bigger this year. Now, we have reports that they're underreporting right now, and I'm not surprised because it's embarrassing. But yes, absolutely, it's getting worse. It is 100% getting worse.
Ms. Moran.
Yes, I think that if things continue, we're going to have a war on our soil. I think that this is a security risk for our country. And the reason why I think that is because people are turning a blind eye to what's actually going on, and that allows these unvetted criminals to come into our country, set up camp in all different states. I was just telling one of the gentlemen here that I was at the border. I met some folks at the border. I saw who lives at the border. I was also up in New England a week ago, and I was surprised at the amount of immigrants from the Congo and from Sudan and from South America in northern New England. That's unheard of. In Massachusetts, they've spent over $1.5 billion in order to...
I want to save about 30 seconds for Ms. Nungaray, so finish that.
All right, but yes.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Ms. Marin. That's quite the contrary. Ms. Nungaray, how about you? Is it getting worse, and do you think it can get worse than it is?
I do believe, yes, it is getting worse, and it will continue to get worse if we do not use every detention center facility bed to detain them until their immigration court hearings to confirm and make sure for us U.S. citizens that we will be safe with letting new individuals in this country, because they're taking our future, our children. They're taking people who are supposed to be making a difference in this world. It'll get worse if we don't make a difference.
Ms. Aguirre, I'm going to fire off one more question. They told us that there are about 2,500 children who were separated from their parents when we heard all the uproar about that. Now I understand that there are 300,000 children who are disconnected, gone missing. What about that?
To me, it clearly sees that there is more, there's more worry about immigrants' well-being than Americans' well-being. And that's troubling, because they rather comfort migrants by not putting them through the process of getting them vetted, and that means staying in a detention center while that vetting process is taking place in an asylum hearing, right? So they're willing to jeopardize American lives in the process. So it almost like they have these backdoor arrangements where they're like, okay, well, we might lose some American lives. Some of them might be criminals, and we're willing to gamble with the Americans' public safety. And that's where we're at right now. Because people need to understand that I personally am not against migration. I am against unvetted migration because, as you said, these migrants are fleeing from something, and here we are creating the same environments here in United States soil that they're fleeing from. You know, it's astonishing to me how many of these victims are actually also asylum seekers that are victims of their own migrants that are there with them in these groups that are being housed together. And it's very troubling to me because it's not good for anybody.
I join you. I think it's getting worse, and it can get worse. Mr. Chairman, I yield.